Alright, we got the new TANGZU TIAN PENG today, and starting with this overall sound, this has a clean, neutral sound to a balanced kind of all-rounded presentation depending on the tip that you use. Starting with the nobles, these gives you a neutral and clean presentation with a slight bite in the vocals, a very neutral and more laid back listening compared to the XENNS, which is more of a balanced all-rounder. It has more energy in both the treble and the low end, and overall sounds a little more energetic and sharper in the transients. Tech-wise, the detail and separation on the TIAN PENG is pretty good for its price. You know, it punches around the same level as the Hype 10s, the Top Pros, and because it has a cleaner listen, you can easily pick out the instrument layering on the tracks, which are pretty solid on these. But bass-wise, it is on the tamer side with both the Senkai Nobles and the ASLAs. It's enough to not sound thin overall because the elevation is pretty gradual. There's no huge sudden gain in the vocals, and there is a slight cut in the upper mid, so it's enough. But I wouldn't recommend these, or it's not my first pick when it comes to hip hop, rock, EDM, anything that needs more mid bass impact, more sub bass rumble. You're not gonna find these very enjoyable for those genres. Again, it's more of a neutral all-rounder for sure. Basically, the TIAN PENG is the BAJIE, but with less low-end impact, less texture in the bass, and slightly more forward in the vocals and more treble detail and resolution. So it's a cleaner version of the BAJIE. So if you're looking for something neutral but still want some bass, some sub bass rumble, then the BAJIE is just gonna be a better fit. Now, if you're choosing between something neutral, you also have the TANGZU XUAN gate, which is around the same price, but it comes with the ESTs. And the main difference between the TIAN PENG and the XUAN gate is that the TIAN PENG has more bite and a sharper imaging and transients attack to the notes, slightly better in the layering. The vocals pop out a little bit more on the TIAN PENG. They're a little more forward with a little more extension, whereas the XUAN gate, it's smoother, it's fuller, there's more mid bass. The guitars, the drums are gonna sound a little bit more impactful. It's less clean and analytical compared to the TIAN PENG, more I guess quote unquote musical, and less in your face, more laid back with the XUAN gate. So if you like a clean and more monitor like sound, then the TIAN PENG would be better. But if you like something that's smoother, more relaxed, then the XUAN gate would be the best fit. Both are around the same when it comes to the technical performance, and it just comes down to the sound preference. Now, tip-wise, I would recommend using the Senkai Nobles or the Senkai Wides, anything that can tame the upper mids a bit, because the ASLAs, it does boost the treble and the upper mids a little bit too much, and there isn't enough bass to kind of offset the extra energy, which means that it can definitely get sharp and fatiguing for prolonged listens with the ASLA tips. The Senkais and Nobles on the other hand strikes a better balance because it's just much tamer in the treble energy, the upper mids. It still maintains some of the bite and the transients, where you still get some dynamics in the vocals from the peaks, right? But it's gonna be much smoother listen than the XENNS. This is even more noticeable on the vocals with the ASLAs. They just sound a bit too sharp, a bit peaky, especially in the consonants around 5 to 8K. There's already 2 peaks from the upper mid, so the other peaks after the treble does make it a little bit overwhelming. Overall, as for scaling, the TIAN PENG is a mid volume set for the most part, around 65, 70 dBs, even with the Senkai Nobles, because again, the peaks, the upper mids, and the treble can feel a little bit sharp and doesn't really allow you to fully crank these up. Genres like K-pop, J-pop, EDM can feel overemphasized in the vocals, the treble energy, and feel a little bit thin because of the lack of low end, plus the peakier upper mids, and just the fact that many K-pop, J-pop, pop songs tend to overboost their vocals and more electronic elements to make it sound sparklier, right? So that doesn't help as well. So all of those combined makes the TIAN PENG not ideal for scaling. However, the TIAN PENG does sound pretty great when it comes to indie, acoustics, ballads, instrumentals, classical, anything that's tamer in the energy would work well with these, especially given its great layering capabilities. Everything is just well separated, very clean. You can pick out the instruments very nicely, and they work very well for those genres. As for some comparisons versus the Top Pro, these two actually sound pretty similar, with the main difference being that the TIAN PENG has a sharper presentation with more bite, more contrast in the vocals. I guess you can say it's slightly more dynamic, whereas the Top Pro is smoother overall, less forward when it comes to just the vocal sharpness, more sparkly and more crispy in the presentation. If you look at the bass shelf, they're pretty much the same, not a huge difference when it comes to the texture, the decay, the attack, maybe a bit sharper on the TIAN PENG, but tech wise, again, they're around the same level, so pretty good for the price. but I would personally take the Top Pros as a clean all-rounder because first of all, it's $130 less on sale, right? But also it just sounds less sharp, you know, not as peaky in the vocals, while having that special treble like sparkly sauce, I guess you can say, and just like smoother overall when you listen to it compared to the Tian Peng. The only instance where the Tian Peng would be the better fit is if you use them with the Senkai Nobos and you want a more neutral and monitor like presentation, so less bass than the Top Pros, you know, more just straight up more neutral. But at that point, I think I'll just take the Xuanwu Gate or the IO Volare. And speaking of the Volare, although it's slightly less detailed and well separated than the Tian Peng, the transients aren't as, I guess, like sharp in the imaging. It is much smoother, fuller, and airier with the SC50 tips, and to me the Volare sounds more natural in the timbre since it just doesn't have the peaks. The ESTs helps with the overall refinement and overall works better as an all-rounder while having, you know, better drivers and around the same price. Same with the Mega 5-7, they also have the ESTs. It's better all-rounded overall, you know, better for more genres. It has more sub-bass boost, better texture in the low end, a more traditional vocal gain. It's not going to be as neutral or clean, as well separated as the Tian Peng, but the overall like transients is much smoother. It feels more natural to me, not as, I guess, again, peaky as the Tian Peng, and feels more complete when it comes to the bass and just the overall tonality. So if you want something more all-rounded, those two would be probably better, or even the Oracle Mark 3s because they're also a pretty good all-rounder set. It's got better bass texture, the impact, the rumble is more extended, and just more quantity in general makes it a little bit better balanced than the Tian Peng. And the vocals and treble are also smoother as well, although the Mark 3s does have a little bit sizzle when it comes to treble. It's not going to be the same way that is like sharp on the Tian Peng. So overall, unless you want that neutral, you know, bass light kind of sound, more monitor presentation, then all three of those, the Oracle Mark 3s, the Mega 5 ESTs, and the Volare is going to be better, just all-rounder for most people, and I think they are just the better value as well. Now finally, versus some vocal-centric sets like the RS5, Oracle Mark 1s, and the ARCANIS, those are all still going to be better than the Tian Peng when it comes to just pure vocal performance. Although the Tian Peng's vocals are clean, it's well balanced, again, very good clarity and detail. It's just not as refined as the Oracle Mark 1s, for example, which is also a clean and neutral kind of sound, kind of balance, you know, it has the sweet vocals, but it doesn't have the same peakiness and like the same sharpness, and just overall smoother, more neutral, while still sounding pretty similar. And then versus the RS5, the Tian Peng also doesn't have the same level of extension, the power, the fullness, and just like the smoothness, because it does lack the low end body, while also again being peakier in the upper mids, which does get a bit sharp if you try to crank up the vocals. Then lastly, compared to the ARCANIS, which is $400 or $330 on sale, which is like almost 2 times less, the Tian Peng also doesn't have the same kind of treble bite and no way. It does have the bite, but this is more sharp, whereas the bite on the ARCANIS is like, I don't want to say sparkly, but it's more airy but also sharp at the same time. I don't know how to explain it, but it doesn't have the same special sauce as the ARCANIS. It doesn't scale as well, not as immersive, because again of the upper mids and the more energetic treble. So even though the Tian Peng has solid vocals, I wouldn't call it a vocal centric set or place it at the same level as the others. It's good, but not S tier good when it comes to vocals, like maybe A tier. So in conclusion, there are a lot of options at around $500 to $600, and given that this is $630, I do think the Tian Peng is a little bit expensive given the competition. Because if you want something clean and balanced, you got the Top Pros at $450 on sale, or the Xuanwu Gate at $500 for a smoother neutral playback, and then you also got the Volare, the Mega 5, the Oracle Mark 3s as all-rounders, you know, with the ESTs. So this is a bit of a hard sell. And then when it comes to the vocals, you also have the RS5, ARCANIS, Oracle Mark 1s, which are all just like straight up better. So there are just a lot of great sets right now, and although the Tian Peng is competitive when it comes to the detail, the technical performance, and the accessories, you know, the plating, the cable is very nice, right? But the value proposition when it comes to the driver and the tuning just isn't really there compared to the others. I think if TANCZU used ESTs instead of the less smooth and cheaper piezo's, then the price probably would have been justified. But all the other ones at $600 all have ESTs, or like a lot better in other ways. Because the Piezos at 630 is giving me Moondrop, Meteor, Microplanar vibes at 500, so probably this is going to be a pass for most people unless you can get a good deal for them at around like $450. Maybe then, give these a shot. They are pretty, nice as an overall package, but just a little bit expensive. Now, as for the TANCHJIM Fission, this is basically a cheaper version of the TANCHJIM Origin. It literally has the same drivers, literally grabs the same with the silver S nozzle, so it pretty much sounds the same as the TANCHJIM Origin, but just for $100 less. If you're looking for something like neutral, balanced, clean, but still full sounding, pretty smooth overall, this is a pretty no-brainer. Under like 200 at around, I think it's like 130. This would be a pretty good pick for that. The Fission pretty much makes the Moondrop, Cadence, Kato, and the Harman like irrelevant. This is just a better tuned version of those. As for the switches, only really the silver middle one sounds good because the rest just doesn't have that much sub bass. There's a huge sub bass roll off, and between the gold and the other two silver nozzles, they pretty much sound the same except for the silver middle one, which is the only one different from the other ones. If you look at the graph, the gold up switch sounds pretty much the same as the other up switches, and then the down switches sound pretty much the same as the other down switches with a variance in like the measuring. But aside from the middle silver one, which does sound a little bit different, they all sound pretty much like very similar in that like they don't have any sub bass. So I wouldn't really recommend the other switches, but the middle silver switch, with the S nozzle, is pretty good because it sounds exactly like the TANCHJIM Origin. Pretty much TANCHJIM took away all the fancier stuff from the Origin, like the build quality. This is a little bit, I guess, like less premium feeling, premium looking. The cable is less premium, again, premium feeling, and then you get a pouch instead of the case. So overall, it took a hit in the accessories, but it's a welcome hit because value-wise, you're getting the same driver, same performance as the Origin, but for $100 less. Now, versus the 4U, this is a tiny bit more resolving. It pulls in a little bit more detail, slightly better in the separation, but it's not a huge difference because they're all single DDs. And the 4U, you can get them for like $55 on sale, so still a very good deal for the 4U. But I guess if you want a tiny bit better clarity and resolution, this would be it's a slight upgrade. I wouldn't just like blindly recommend upgrading to these if you have the 4U, but like it is slightly better than the 4U. Although in terms of the tuning variety, the 4U is actually better because you actually get like a warmer sound and then a neutral sound and then a bass roll off, where this is just a bass roll off and then a neutral kind of sound. So variety wise, the 4U slightly better and better value. Tip wise, I would recommend the tri clearance to just open up the sound more, get a little bit more of that treble, makes the details stand out a little bit more. You can also go for the final E's, the Venus if you want more bass. If you want like a smoother sound, you can go the Senkai regulars. I wouldn't recommend the Senkai Nobos or the Senkai Whites because I think they just gimp out the upper mids a bit too much for the sound. It sounds like even more dead with the other ones, a bit too smooth, I guess. So those would not, I wouldn't really recommend it unless you find the upper mids just a little bit too much, but I think you're gonna find these fine. They are pretty smooth overall. Scaling wise, these are pretty decent because they are smooth in the overall sound. It's not that peaky, it's not that sharp, not too over boosted. Again, a very neutral playback, a little bit warm. These scale around to like 75, 80 dBs on slower tracks, and like with K-pop, J-pop, stuff like that, those would probably scale around like 65 to 70 depending on the track. And overall, just like not a V-shape kind of sound, not a energetic kind of sound. So these work pretty well for K-pop if you found like other IEMs to be a bit too sharp, a bit too like bright and energetic. Now, as for hip-hop, EDM, rap, this is not going to be my first pick because it doesn't have that sub-bass, rumble, and extension. Even the 4U would be better for that because it just has more sub-bass. This sounds a bit too like safe on those genres, not as dynamic, not as engaging in just like the overall rumble, the texture. So not the first pick for those, but I would recommend them for rock because of the mid bass is pretty nice and the tamer upper mids pretty good for rock and metal at mid volume. You can't really go too crazy on these, but again, if you're just listening at mid volume, I think these sound pretty decent for rock as well. Tech wise, these are the same as the Origin, same tuning, same graph, same driver, right? So it's pretty good given the price. Not as quite detailed as the Super Mix 4 or like even the Nova, but overall it is still pretty good, competitive for the tech. Layering is solid. It's not a super nuanced, treble, like sparkly, very extended in the air, the cymbals, but overall you're gonna be pretty happy with the performance on these. Now, as for some comparisons versus some of the other all-rounders like the Super Mix 4, the Nova EM6L, This is going to be less shouty, it's going to be fuller, smoother sounding, not as technical as them, but tuning wise it is like a safer kind of sound, not I guess as dynamic as the other stuff. But overall, again, this is a more neutral and laid back approach to the all-rounder kind of sound. If that's what you're looking for, these would be a pretty good option. And then versus the Defiant is going to sound a little more dynamic, slightly more V-shape, more sub-bass focus, more exciting in general. The Fission again is more of a mid-bass, neutral, like smoother kind of sound. The Defiant would be better for genres like hip-hop, you know, EDM, even some pop stuff because of the sub-bass and extra energy. It just makes it sound more lively and more engaging. Whereas when it comes to rock, indie, you know, acoustics, even classical, this would be better for that. And if you found K-pop and J-pop to be a little bit too like, you know, shouty, then these would be better than Defiant for that as well, because the overall sound is smoother and more chill versus the slightly more V-shaped kind of sound signature of the Defiant. Tech-wise, again, these are around the same. I would say in terms of variety and the build, this is better built. The Defiant definitely has QC issues when it comes to like the case, the overall channel imbalance. This is made out of metal. The Defiant does look better in the plating, I will say that. Performance-wise, it's not like a huge difference between the two. Maybe slightly cleaner on the Fission, but pretty close. And overall, both are pretty solid pick, but just depending on what you're looking for. Then versus the EW300, now this gets a bit tricky because the EW300 is half the price at $60 to $70 on sale. This is double the price. And tech-wise, I would say they're pretty similar. So like the EW300 is going to be more bassy, it's going to be more dynamic, it's going to sound a little bit like sharper in the treble, but not like overly done. I think it's just the right amount. And you also got the nozzles, which does actually change the sound. Like it goes from a bassy balance to like a warmer sound with the nozzles on the SIMGOTs. This again is just pretty much one tuning. I wouldn't really recommend the other like tuning switches. So value wise, the EW300 is definitely better. Tech wise, again, they're around the same. If you want more sub bass, you listen to more hip hop, the EW300 will be better. It just has a lot more sub bass. But if you're looking for slightly better layering, then that would be the Fission. But yeah, aside from that, the Fission is a pretty easy recommendation. Moondrop needs to take notes from TANCHJIM. They literally just like made a cheaper version of the Origin, and I think Moondrop should do that with the Harman, just like make the Harman but just for like $150 or like $200 max, right? But easy rec if you want something neutral, balanced, slightly warm, full in the vocals, you know, natural sounding and pretty smooth. So yeah, I hope you guys found this review helpful. I got the Luna and the Monarch Mark IVs coming in very soon in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Stay tuned for that. Giveaway is still ongoing, so good luck to everyone on that. But aside from that, thanks for watching, and I'll see everyone in the next one.
Special thanks to Dom Q, Rark's Cat, Mystic Spoon Attack, B. Urak, Discal Scaldus, Walker Standard, Patrick, User, Oh Really, Contain Guava Juice Gains, Mr. Gorillas, Polly J, Giseng Young, Christopher Jackson, Henry Claudia, Son of a Horse, 777ZK, Wizard, Obi, Trouble Extended, Frickalicious, Ricardo, Tapis R, Choco Norris, Tomat, Shrimp Backleet, FKSRG, Cousin Fat, Julius Philip, Dead Riddle, Doha, Armor, Nico, Parham, Nicholas, Brandon, Addy, Siriko, Harder, Wayu, Michael, Denure, Venetius, Trackstar, Andy, LL, Nico, Sammy, Fun Times, and Shrijib. Thank you guys so much for the support.